If you're for welcoming and fostering diversity in the workplace, you are in the right place. I'm going to defer to my colleague to let her introduce herself first, and then I'll do my introduction.
Great. Hi, I'm Alma Rosa Alvarez, and I'm a professor at Southern Oregon University. And one of the things that I do is I teach in the English department. I mostly teach ethnic literature. I have a partner in crime. She's allowed me to be a partner in crime and working on some diversity issues on our campus. And in the community, I help bring the Hispanic Mass to Our Lady of the Mountain. And I'm currently involved in the Race Equity Coalition, which Marjorie can tell you a little bit more about.
And so I'm Marjorie Trueblood Gamble. I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Southern Oregon University. And I just wanted to let you know that our PowerPoint presentation is probably, we've made attempts to make it more neutral to various businesses, but in our style of presentation, we like to draw upon other research that's been done because that's what the expectation is in academia. And so just bear with us when we present some of those slides. In addition to doing my, my job, which seems very, very big at SOU, I also serve as the Title IX coordinator, which means that I try to work at prohibiting sex-based and gender-based discrimination at our institution through forms of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, stalking, and other violence. And so with that said, we like to talk to each other, we like to talk at you, but we're also going to have some moments for engagement, and we have a few ground rules for you. And these are things that you might also want to consider and incorporate in your daily practices too, or in meetings that you use as well. So some of these rules are: try to avoid gendered language. I know that I fall in the trap of sometimes saying, hey guys, how are you? Clearly in this space I see, I'm going to make the assumption, but I see a lot of people who are presenting as female. Guys tends to be gendered towards male audiences. If you find me slipping up, let me know, and I'll defer to the other words that I like to use, like hello friends, good people, or folks. Sometimes I might say y'all, not usually, but sometimes. If you're sharing with this group, we believe in sharing the air, or using the acronym WAIT, which is why am I talking, if you are a large talker, or why am I not talking, or why aren't I talking, if you are more on the silent side. Additionally, expect unfinished business for the session. In fact, our last assignment for you will be a to be continued, and we'll ask you to do more work. Assume the best intentions of the people who are gathered in this space. And when you're talking within this space, use I statements. Try to use people first language. How many of you are familiar with that? So a few, I see some nods. In case you're not familiar with people first language, we don't say colored people, that's antiquated. We say people of color, just like we say people with disabilities. So that would be an example of people first language. Mistakes are awesome, so push yourself, take risks. And they're awesome when you learn from them. So let's try to disrupt those cycles. And if you need vocabulary breaks, let us know. So this is the world that we live in, and we might say words or terms that you're not familiar with. Raise your hand, don't be afraid, and we can explain it for you. Take care of yourself, and then respect the confidentiality of this space, and share the lessons that you receive from here, but not necessarily the details of people's personal stories. Can we agree upon those things?
Yes.
Are there additional ground rules that you would like to incorporate there? All right. We also have, what's that?
Be respectful.
Be respectful. Thank you very, very much. We also have some goals, which Alma's going to share.
Great. And I'm notorious for saying man. I just want to let you know, so if I slip up, let me know, because I'm like, hey man, right? And then you get the sense of how old I am, right? So the learning outcomes that we have for you all today is we wanted to help people understand the various forms of bias. And I actually was really grateful for Jenny Johnson, and because she sort of already began the conversation a little bit about how we are not only looking at bias that women face in the workplace, but we're also looking at women of color, LGBTQ, trans, disability, that there are various different kinds of bias out there, some that maybe some of you might not have taken into account. We wanted to also, as an outcome, we're going to be doing 2 different kinds of exercises, and one is a personal self-inventory to see where you are at in terms of your own biases, or where you are in terms of like your inclusion of people, because sometimes we think we're really inclusive, and then as we kind of go through like this checklist, we find that maybe there's some place actually to improve and work. And so we're going to help you with that today, and so that you can continue your sort of growth in that area. And then the last one is we're wanting to help you recognize where your organization may be in relation to diversity and inclusion. So we have an exercise where you can also sort of think a little bit about where your organization might be in terms of its diversity and inclusion work, and we're hoping that you can recognize that and maybe have some goals at the end of the session for yourself or your organization.
The other thing that I wanted to state as Alma switches the slides is we were inspired as well to do this presentation because we offer a lot of programs at SOU pertaining to diversity and race awareness and social justice. And a lot of times after those presentations or those programs, people in the audience, it never fails, there will always be one person that will ask the question, what can I specifically do to make things better, right? And so when we get to the inventory for the self and the institutions, there are some concrete things that people can do, but this is not a prescription for a fix-all. And know that these things are going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of work. The other thing that I wanted to share as we think about why is diversity and inclusion important, and that's not a rhetorical question, we're going to be asking that, but to really think of inclusion as intentional practices and not just something that happens when we get a bunch of different people together. So, for you, why is diversity and inclusion important to you? And you have to be able to answer that question if you're trying to foster that welcoming environment for others.
So it's a question to you all right now. Like, does anyone want to take a stab at why it's important?
Well, I have never, I do not believe that I see people as human beings. And so when I started working for my company, we have to practice fair housing. And so some of the things that they've taught all of us is about those particular things. And it's always amazing to me that I have to even think about it, because for me it's like, well, yeah. However, I've seen things where people have looked at different situations and formed an opinion, and we treat one as we would treat everyone. And so it's nice to be, for that, my personal belief in that, to be reinforced through the job that I do.
Great, thank you.
So I work in the hospitality industry, and our job is to help people feel welcome. And I think that my goal, my true goal, is to have everyone feel welcome, or our employees feel like at any time they walk into a room that they're welcome and they're embraced. And you know, I think that there's always that disconnect, you know, within the organization, is, you know, we got jobs to do, but there are people who feel like outsiders, and that's not okay. So how can we really embrace and everyone feels included and welcome?
Great.
Definitely, yes. We'll take 2 more.
Yeah.
So here.
So I am a part of the LGBTQ community, and I am of a certain age, and so I felt the exclusion. So I always try to be as inclusive as possible because of everyone, because of how it feels to be excluded. And I was in the military way before, don't ask, don't tell, so it was it was very exclusive. It was a good old person's club.
Well, you know, most of us are here because we're women in business and we're women in leadership positions, or we want to be women in leadership positions. And you know, thinking about the business realm, we're all in business together, and generally we have a diverse workplace. And people that are brainstorming and working together and in teamwork generally are better with those diverse backgrounds. You know, we make better business decisions when you have people in diverse backgrounds. And so we have to have that inclusion and that respect in order to be successful.
Great. That's actually a really perfect segue, right, into some of the motives that we might use for diversity and inclusion. And so oftentimes one kind of motive that someone will have for wanting to pursue diversity and inclusion is because it's good for business. So like what you're saying about how having diverse groups of people sometimes really has like better business outcomes and really actually makes it better for the bottom line, right? So that's one kind of motivator that a lot of people often have for diversity and inclusion.
Another motivator for diversity and inclusion is the legal motive or the legal case. Within the United States context and within many states, it's illegal to discriminate against different groups of people who have certain protected statuses or identities, right? And so some people might not necessarily be compelled or believe in the height of the business case, but the legal case helps us out in that regard in terms of what we need to do on the legal side and what we need to do for compliance. There's also another case, which is where our passion stems from, which is
the moral case. So a lot of times it's like we want to do it because it feels right, or like I'm thinking about I don't know your name, Rhonda. What
Yes.
Rhonda said about, you know, and I kind of sometimes fall into this as well. Like if you felt discriminated, you really want to make sure that other people don't, and then you're coming from a place of like, and it's the right thing to do, right? So that it's connected. It's coming here, right? Like a moral kind of sense for pursuing diversity and inclusion. The problem, though, is that go ahead.
the problem is that if you pursue one of these motives in isolation without accounting for the other things, you miss the comprehensive picture. There are times when I'm led by more by the business case, and I'm like, why don't they get it? Why don't they just see that this is the right thing to do and not place a dollar sign over a person's head? But if that's what's going to compel them to fund that initiative or to support that community, then I need to be able to talk that talk as well. And so hopefully having an understanding of all three of these cases will help inspire your organization to pursue diversity and inclusion in a more comprehensive way.
Yeah, and I guess ultimately what we're saying is if someone is coming from it from a business sense and not a moral sense, or only from a legalistic sense, don't close the door on the conversation, right? Like there's space for all of those voices to come together and have a more comprehensive look.
So for me, in doing diversity and inclusion work, and I'm not an expert, I'm just a nerd. I like to say that a lot. I think it's important for us to think about identity. In the middle, we have the primary aspects of identity, which looks at more of the physical characteristics that we have to know how someone is diverse, or how someone is diverse, right? So those are the things that we usually make those snap judgments about, whether it's the age, gender, sexual orientation, disability, ethnic heritage, or race. But outside of that core are a bunch of other things that inform the people that we are today, right? And sometimes we default to that and say, well, my identity is more salient in terms of my family status. I don't really go on my life, this is not true for me, but somebody might feel, I don't really go through my life thinking about being a woman. I think of myself as more of a human being that's a mother, that's more salient, that's more important to me. Right? Whatever or however you identify, it's important to know that other people are going to identify in different ways, and to know that there are a lot of things that make up our identities, right? And so it's important to think about how those identities work together in certain situations and in certain contexts, and to know that there is power that are attributed to certain identities and marginalization that is attributed to other identities. And if you don't recognize that, then you might not understand the oppression and the struggle that's taking place. It's also important to know that most of us in this room identify as women, and in our society we might see that as a marginalized identity, but there are points of privilege within our identities too, right? And if we just focus on that and not see our privileged identities, we can lose sight of the ways that we still might be oppressing other groups. Right? And so it's so for me, it's important to take a social justice model, right? To think about all the forms of oppression that take place so that I'm not contributing to that oppression. I was sharing with Alma that there's a quote, we're impacted by our marginalized identities, but we respond with our privileged identities. So an example of that might be if I walk into a bank and somebody reads me as an African American female and is less than respectful to me, and I think it's because of how I identify, I might think in my head, they don't know me. They don't know that I have this degree or that degree, right? So my privilege status in terms of being educated, right, and not really responding from that marginalized identity. I think it's also important to recognize our privilege. Even when we were putting this presentation together, we were thinking about our marginalized identities and thinking about, okay, how can we make things better for women and women of color? And we were thinking, oh, we left out disability, LGBTQ, religion, and so we had to go back and think about what other examples we could bring into it. So we're constantly challenging ourselves on how we can be intentional in including other people, whether they share in our identities or they don't. And that's a challenge that we have for you all today too. There are times when I go to meetings that are for women and I'm the only woman of color there. And I think that that's important because our identities are intersectional. We have to think about all that we're bringing to the table.
So a lot of times when we're doing diversity and inclusion work, there are a lot of challenges to actually, that actually prevent us from continuing the work. So sometimes we can get like really ramped up, excited about it, and then we have some of these challenges. And one of the biggest challenges that we find is the implicit bias challenge. So implicit bias, I think many of us have been educated in a way to understand or know that there are certain really obvious forms of racism and we don't participate in them. We're like, oh no, like this is clearly bad. We don't use this word anymore. We don't call people this particular type of language. Yet, even if we've been through diversity training, so I'll use myself as an example. I've done several different types of diversity trainings, and I find myself still coming to some of these places where like the sort of tapes that have been formed in my head still kind of inform some of the ways that I might interact with someone. And the clearest one for me is around Native American people, right? I can't in some ways help be the product of American culture where in our house we saw a lot of cowboy and Indian movies. How many of them did Hollywood produce? And some of those like spaghetti westerns, are 4,000 of them, right? And so, yeah, so, and I can tell you that I've seen a great number of those, right? So what happens is that even though I may be informed about Native American peoples and where they are and their struggles, there's something about this kind of like tape that's been sort of constructed in my head that in the first instance, I'll sort of go to like a place like that, where I'll go like to, this image that I might have about the poor person on a reservation or something. And so I'll be confronted with that idea of like, oh, this person's an urban Native American. Why am I surprised, right? This shouldn't be something that is surprising to me. But obviously I have this sort of unconscious sort of element, right? And we have all of those kinds of things. Like, so if you've ever done the thing where you see, an African American male, this is something that sometimes happens where people, or a Latino male, and you're in a space and you grab for your bag, you're not even noticing that you're doing it, but your body language sometimes belies some of that implicit bias. And so that's something that begins to be a challenge. So we may be educated, but we may have our own kind of implicit bias that we might not even realize we are bringing to the table that begin to challenge the diversity work. The other one is status quo bias. And so with status quo bias, what happens is sometimes we don't want to change the culture of something because that's the way that it's sort of been. Where we're kind of like, well, this is how it is, right? And so we're afraid of like, shifting something or changing the culture. And we'll have people that will tell us sometimes like, we've been doing this for 15 years this way, right? And we might come upon that particular type of challenge. I don't know if you want to add anything to those biases.
Right, and I think that you have to get over the status quo bias if you really want to do something about the implicit bias.
Mhm.
We've had a speaker come to our valley a few times this past year named John Linson, and he says the number one thing to do to interrupt the implicit or unconscious bias is the amount of motivation that you have to change, which means that we have to also disrupt the status quo bias.
Mhm.
In addition, another challenge that happens in terms of diversifying or fostering an inclusive and welcoming workplace is minimization, denial, and conflation. So sometimes in our points of privilege, we might minimize the concerns that come to us from people in underrepresented groups, or we might even denial that things are taking place, which is crazy making for underrepresented people.
Yeah.
And something that happens with marginalized people is that we conflate our oppression with other people's oppression. So I'm impacted this way, and because I know oppression, and this other person identifies this way, the oppression must be the same, and that can't be farther from the truth. So it's important to check in with people about what their experiences is or are, so that we're not conflating it and disrespecting people's own experience.
Can I just, for the denial part and the minimization, I cannot sufficiently stress how difficult it is for someone who experiences, and maybe everybody in the room, especially if you identify as a woman, has had some kind of sense of this experience. But if you have other kinds of marginalized identities like a LGBTQ or a person of color, when you have someone deny or minimize your experience, you actually do feel, as Marjorie said, like you're losing your mind because other people are telling you, no, this couldn't have happened. Oh, no, not here. Maybe it happened in like Grants Pass or whatever, right? You know, and it really sort of starts making you feel like you're losing your mind, like you're misreading something. So it is really sort of it's challenging,
Right.
difficult.
And we do hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Working in Ashland in the university, and people thinking that Ashland is a more progressive space, they don't want to believe that injustices can still happen in that area. The crazy making idea behind that is oftentimes labeled as gaslighting. How many of you are familiar with that? All right. So some people are shaking their heads no. Where a husband wanted to get rid of his wife. And so we started adjusting the lights, and so she would say something. He's like, oh no, that's not happening. And she's like, no, I think it's happening. And he would keep doing this over and over again until she actually went crazy and they took her away and he was done with her, right? And so it's those things that happen within our society to make people, especially those who are marginalized or underrepresented, feel that they're crazy when they're also trying to challenge the status quo. Some other challenges is that how we see injustice or oppression in our society, whether we see it as an individual or interpersonal system or aspect or situation versus a systemic aspect or situation, right? So a lot of times when we're talking about any form of oppression, whether that's racism, sexism, heterosexism, and speaking of homophobia, people are quick to say, oh, I am not racist, I am not sexist, I am not homophobic, I am not prejudiced, there's not a prejudiced bone in my body, right? And you might be saying all the right things and not saying any of the negative things, but you also have to understand that the reasons why oppression still exists is that it's embedded in the fabric of our country, it's embedded in the fabric of our institutions, and it's not only about us and the personal actions that we take, but also how we're holding our organizations and institutions accountable, right? So that means that there's things that we have to do for our own self-work, and there's things that we have to do for our organizations in terms of their work that they need to do as well.
Great. Another kind of challenge that we sometimes encounter is the reverse isms. So sometimes in an organization, you might have people, you might have people that are really actively trying to work for diversity and inclusion, and then you'll have some of those privileged individuals that are feeling somewhat threatened come in and occupy a type of victim status where they'll accuse the organization that's trying to work on something as being like, say, having reverse discrimination or reverse sexism or reverse, and so we call that the reverse isms, because people come in and then that fear that like you might actually be engaging in something that is like some kind of reverse-ism might be something that prevents you from moving forward, right? But it's sometimes really important to interrogate Like, where is that person coming from? Are they coming from a place where they feel like their privilege is actually being challenged and their power? And are they really occupying a victim position? Because if you sometimes look carefully, it really isn't about taking that person down per se. It's really about being able to create some kind of equity in the workplace. But that's a really big one that a lot of times organizations are like, I don't want to be accused of a type of reverse racism or reverse discrimination. And that sort of presents a really big challenge in moving forward.
And the last thing on our list, which is very, very faint, is that sometimes we hear that a challenge to diversity and inclusion, especially diversifying our workforce, is our location. Where we're located in a very rural area and that we're not going to be able to attract minorities, or we're not going to be able to attract LGBTQ individuals because they won't feel safe here, and so we don't really try to actively recruit people. Well, I have a few questions about that. Is what will we do if we were more diverse, and are we actually capitalizing on the diversity that we have here? Recently we were looking at, because I work in education, I was trying to figure out what are some of the future trends for higher education, and looking at the demographics for the 4th grade classes in Ashland, Medford, and Central Point. The 4th grade demographic composition is all above 20%. Ashland's 23%, Medford's 27%, Central Point's 23%. So knowing that almost, or in some cases over a quarter of our population here in white Oregon are people of color, we need to be prepared on how we're going to be servicing the people in our community, and really start actively programming, intentionally planning and training ourselves to be ready to serve folks. Great. Yes.
Oh.
So I just wanted to add to your list. The other thing that I see is sort of this romanticization of the other that happens, that really gets in the way of doing really good anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-bias work. And it can be very nuanced, and it can be very, very difficult to root out, because it's really based on a very limited view of the race or culture, and it can be very difficult to move past it.
Yes. Yeah, so there is a kind of, so like if we could have like a tangible example, I'm thinking of maybe the way that the Latino population here was primarily a migrant population. And so a lot of times what I find as a Latina is that people will have a kind of romantic view of that migrant farm worker, and then make an assumption that every single other Latino that is here has that particular experience or background, and then make assumptions, right? And romanticize that particular position, like, oh, the farm worker out in the field that loves the land, right? You know, and that kind of thing that is a kind of romantic stereotype sort of view that doesn't account for other people's sort of like wider experiences, right?
The other example might be the diversity that the Oregon Shakespeare Festival is able to draw in for the season, and attributing any person of color that people aren't familiar with being temporary or affiliated with that, and that they're the good kind of people, and they're good because they're good because they perform for us, but they're also good because they're only going to be here temporarily.
Yeah.
Right?
I was just eating during lunch, talking to Marissa, our keynote speaker for this morning, and that's what they were saying, like, oh, we went to lunch and it was nice. And, you know, they're obviously from out of town, so it's a different experience from somebody who lives here in the valley, just going from like Medford to Central Point, Ashland, for them to come, you know, I'm assuming people that they were coming to the show, you know, to the Shakespeare.
So just, yeah, thank you. And so Alma Rosa is doing a great job in being our timekeeper. So we're going to fly through some more doom and gloom, right?
Before we get into the good work.
And before we get into the good part, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we want it to be rainbows and kittens, and we also have to talk about exclusion and how it manifests if we're going to get there, right? So there was a study that was done in 2004 where they were looking at bias in employment practices. Over 5,000 resumes were sent out to different jobs that were advertised in different websites. And it was the same resume, they just changed the name to sounding like traditionally white sounding names to black sounding names, whatever that means. I think that people, as we continue to grow older and generations come, people are becoming more and more creative with names. But for this study, they were using names like Bob, Tom and Sally, and Tyrone, Tamika, Rashad, and in the study they found that the white names received 50% more callbacks than the black sounding names on the resumes, just showing that implicit bias is still alive and well, even in 2004 and even in 2015, 2016. I have a surrogate son who's older. His name is Kafui Akakpo. He was putting out resumes and receiving no callbacks. And so he changed his name, and then the calls started coming. So it's not that he wasn't qualified, it was based off of that name and what people were reading into it.
Yeah, I had a student recently, similar situation. Her fiance was not getting employed, and he changed his name from Pedro to Pete, and then used his mother's last name instead of his Hispanic sounding last name, and started receiving callbacks. So it's kind of interesting, right? So recently, some of you might be aware that the Harvard Business Review published a really interesting study. This is like just barely like I think last week I told you about it, and then I was like, we've got to get this slide, and this is about the status quo thing that I was telling you guys about. That there's a really interesting issue when you have primarily if your composition of candidates, finalists in a pool are primarily men, that creates a type of status quo within that candidate pool. And if you only have one woman, statistically in this study, they found that the woman had 0% chance of getting hired, right? That's pretty horrible, I think, right? And then if you disrupted the status quo and you had half of the men and half of the women, so their controlling number was 4. The women had 50% of a chance, and then if you had more women than men, the chance increases even more. They did the same study, by the way, in terms of color, and they found the same results, right? So, you know, and I think actually maybe we can skip on this one because it's essentially capturing the same information, that if you had 3 white men and 1 person of color, a black man, that's what they did the study with, you'd found that the man statistically was not going to get hired. So
another gender bias example is looking at the STEM research, and they found that just based off of appearance, the candidate's appearance, both men and women were more likely to select the male candidates in the position, right? And so even if it's working to what our espoused values are, we might act differently because of the status quo, right? So we might have egalitarian values, but we've been conditioned to think about who is worthy, who's valuable for certain positions. And we have to be aware and have to be thinking and asking ourselves to engage in certain types of inquiry.
So as Marjorie is changing the slide, I'm just going to say that I, as a professor, even though I'm teaching ethnic literature, have found myself sometimes calling more on the male students than on the female students. And I've been horrified by that. Like, I'm like, why am I doing this, right? And I'm a feminist, right? At least that's what I tell myself.
The way of third wave feminists, which means that we're like thinking about humanity and the good for all, and not just thinking about just women people or people who identify as female. We also wanted to throw in some statistics around unemployment for disability. For the labor force participation, people with disabilities comprise of about 19.9%. People without disabilities, 68.6%. And then the unemployment rate, as you can see, it's more than twice for people with disabilities than people without, right? So really trying to challenge ourselves to think about how can we be more inclusive in these other forms of identity as well. For LGBTQ folks in the workplace, some of the weak employment protections have led to a lot of discrimination that's happening across our country. I'm from the great state of Indiana, who really started these religious rights laws last year, which has also carried over to North Carolina, which is terrible. And these protections, or the lack of protections, have led to LGBTQ folks more likely to be poor across race and ethnicity. 90% of trans folks who are on the job are being harassed in their places of employment. And on the positive note, for the Fortune 500 companies that do have protections in place based off of their policies, they have seen increased productivity and morale. So 96% of those companies have indicated that. Yes?
What's the Q?
Oh, queer.
Queer.
Okay,
There's so LGBTQ is also, I'm glad that you asked that question.
sorry, I mean, I know, we know the other four, but I wasn't aware of
Yeah.
it.
And this is what I will say, that's even an abbreviation because it really is an alphabet soup. There are other identities that are not necessarily labeled within those letters.
Okay.
Yeah,
So there's a lot.
Because you might hear LGBTQI plus, and then an A and then a plus, right? But generally, if you hear Q, it's queer. And it's sometimes there's a generational difference. Like I know older folks that will never identify as queer, but a lot of young people are using that label.
It was a negative connotation.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It
and
wasn't a positive, thing you said.
yeah, and there's John Retchie, who was a queer writer, a gay writer. He would ask to be called a gay writer, who often had horrible encounters with the police, where he was constantly called that, and he's like, I'm never gonna own that term. So it's a generational, for some people, a generational difference. So intentional recruiting, when we go into recruiting, the next couple slides are going to be now moving us hopefully a little bit into like what you can do for your organization. And one of the things you want to do is, I love what our previous speaker was saying in the ballroom. I'm forgetting the first name. I'm remembering Johnson. Jenny Johnson was saying about how the way that her company was working like within the community, right? And having people that are of that community. So assessing the needs of your organization and the community that is around is really crucial in terms of an intentional recruiting process. You want to have your organization talk to organizations that support underrepresented folks. If your organization hasn't done diversity and inclusion work and hasn't been intentional in its recruiting, in this valley there are some really great organizations that have been doing some very intentional work. I'm going to point to Maria Underwood as a representative of La Clínica, because La Clínica has done some really great, inclusive, intentional type of work. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So talk to those organizations that are out there. And if you're not aware of them, we're going to be giving you our business cards and we could hook you up, right? So the other thing that's really interesting is if I were a person looking for a job, and this does happen among people that have marginalized identities, and you're looking through websites and you're looking at job descriptions, if I don't see any anti-discrimination policies connected to that and I don't see those on the website, I might have second thoughts about applying for that particular type of job. So if you're wanting to intentionally recruit, you want to make sure that you post those kinds of anti-discrimination policies in places where they're visible or where they're part of the mission statement of the organization, because that person that's applying is going to be looking at those particular kinds of features of the company. Does that make sense? You also want to provide diversity training for the people who are going to be looking at the pool of candidates, making the selections, doing the interviews, right? Because of all of the challenges we spoke about before, right? Sometimes you get all of this other stuff that's working, but you have a pool of people that are a really homogenous type of group and that haven't had any kind of diversity training to maybe recognize their own implicit bias. So you want to make sure that you provide that for the people that are part of that job creation process, right? And then of course, don't make it a one and done, because you want to make sure that there's diversity training continuously in your organization. And then once you get your people in, you want to make sure that you offer incentives and opportunities to retain those employees. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
So for an example of that would be what Jenny Johnson was talking about, maybe allowing employees to work from home or remotely might be a benefit for some folks. or thinking about, does your workplace or organization offer child care, or how flexible is the time? So really thinking about things that might not just benefit women, but people in general.
Yeah, as you change the slide, I'm thinking about my husband's organization. My husband does a lot of community work. He's an immigration attorney, so he goes out and talks to people about immigration issues. And what's great about his organization is that they count that as part of his job, whereas he's been in other jobs where that's not counted as part of the work, and that kind of, well, sucks. All right.
So while we've given you tips, there's still bias that can come up when you're going through the screening of the applications. I had the good fortune of participating in Oregon State's, they call their program Search Advocate Program, where they train people to sit on their search committees. At SOU, we're creating our own diversity advocate program that's very similar, but slightly different in some ways. But they say that there are some biases that come up at different phases. To be more generalized for you all who work in different sectors, at the job descriptions, if you have just the facts and it's uninspired, that's not really going to draw upon people. If you narrowed the job description based off of the incumbent's contribution, that's also more likely, the likelihood is increased for bias to occur. So if you refer to a certain position as Jenny's old position versus the actual title of the position, you might be in for some challenges. The narrow focus on tasks and qualifications instead of future initiatives and emerging interests. So if you're still stuck in the past and not really thinking about what the future might hold, you might fall into that trap. And then also having rigid position qualifications that might not have anything to do with what you need in that position is also a trap. And that the expectations of the qualifications, you're using that to weed out a bunch of people, right? So it should be more of a sift rather than a filter.
Then in the recruitment efforts or the recruiting efforts, recently Marjorie and I were part of a conversation where an organization was trying to hire a particular position, and that particular organization was having some really passive recruiting efforts. So we sort of had queried the organization about whether they were being really intentional and inclusive in sort of the way that they were kind of posting the job, where were they posting it, etc. And some of the things that were like reported back to us were, well, we heard that there was like this African American like space where someone could like post stuff, but we weren't able to find it, right? And I was like, well, what about the Latino ones, right? We have Caminos here. Like, did it get advertised on Caminos? Did you use a larger Hispanic or Latino basis? And the organization had done none of that, right? So sometimes people will say they're interested in diversity and then kind of say no one applied. But if you're not like sort of seeking out those like venues, right, where you know that people might be looking, then we might call what you're doing a passive reliance on advertising, right? So you want to make sure that you are really sort of being proactive about those and really not engaging in insufficient recruitment efforts. And then ultimately go, well, it must be because of the location, right?
And then screening the applicants is delegating the employee screening to a homogeneous small subset.
One of the things that strikes me, and Marjorie and I were talking about this, is a lot of times when we look at the behaviors that are desirable for creating an inclusive environment, and we go down the list, listening to understand, seeking multiple points of view, giving and receiving feedback, enhancing inclusion, addressing inappropriate behavior, and leading by example, most of us probably in this room would feel pretty confident to say, yeah, you know what, I do this. I seek multiple points of view. I give and receive feedback, and etc., right? But what we have is the same kind of like list of behaviors with the breakdown of even more behaviors, you know, subsets of those behaviors. So what we would like for you to do right now is to take out a pen or pencil and then put a check mark, you know, check the behaviors you already exhibit, but we want you to notice where the gaps may be for yourself. Does that make sense? Okay.
So if I were to ask, and this comes from Carmen Morgan with Morgan Consulting, who is a consultant who's done a lot of work with OSF and also Ashland High School. If I were to ask this question, I'm gonna make this assumption that how many of you value diversity? Every hand would go up, right? So how many of you value diversity? Right? I value it too, right? But there is a difference between valuing diversity and managing for diversity, right? And I love this slide. So when you get this PowerPoint, please spend some time on it. Valuing diversity is great, but it requires no action. It utilizes disconnected short-term activities, and it's a relatively easy position to hold. Whereas managing diversity speaks more to what you're doing at the structural or institutional or organizational level, and thinking about what you're doing with those policies and practices and being intentionally inclusive to bring in folks, to support folks so that they can be successful. It requires action, accountability, and results. It's committed to organizational change, and it's using concerted, organized, strategic long-term efforts, and it is difficult to be done. They say that for a culture to change, it takes a minimum of 7 years, right? So a lot of times we think that when we're trying to like achieve diversity, we can do this training and we've all been cured and we're gonna be kumbaya in the circle and everybody's gonna wanna come to us, and that's not how it works, right? And so I just wanted to put that out there. So it's great to value diversity, but we, as people working in institutions and organizations, we need to manage for it as well.
Yeah. So, and please don't be discouraged when you hear the 7-year mark, because that seems like, whoa, right? You know, but you really want to, you know, it is a long-term, and it's like a forever plan. It is a forever plan, really. What did you say? No, oh, someone outside. Okay. All right. So now it's time to assess your organization. So you did your personal inventory, right? And then now it's time to assess your organization. And we have a couple of like listings of different places where your organization might be.
Okay.
Okay. So the handout is going around. So look at the little boxes and then let us know where you are. Maybe. Or maybe you don't want to let us know. Okay? And how are we doing on time? So don't tell us anything yet. Look at your little boxes and then maybe mark which box your organization might be in by looking at the criteria. Okay?
And I just want to let you know that this tool, this assessment comes from, it's inspired by the work of Bailey Jackson, who's done a lot of work on multicultural organizational development, and was created by members of the Social Justice Training Institute. But the main person that headed that up was Kathy Aubert. And so after the session, there's more in-depth work that you can do if you want those tools or want to see about getting Kathy to come. We can try to help you in that work as well.
Yeah, because the great thing about this is let's say that your organization is in the club section or the compliance section. There are some, this social justice group has some really specific steps and strategies on what to do to get your organization to the next level. I think we'll have a couple minutes.
Okay.
It'll take us right to the time.
Okay. That works.
Okay. Did you find where you fit? Kind of? All right. So, what we are interested, so one thing that I've learned from Marjorie, which I really love, and I just want to credit her for this, is that she never allows us to leave a presentation without having some kind of action plan. She's like, what's one thing you could commit to, or that you can commit your hopefully try to commit your organization to, right? What's one action that you will take? So in true Marjorie spirit, she's asking us to do some action plans, and now I'm asking you too, because I've been sort of bitten by the action plan bug, right? And so what is one action that you can commit to on a personal level? So you've done that little inventory to see where you're at in order to be an inclusive leader or citizen. Okay, that's one question. And then what is one thing you can do to address inclusivity at the institutional level within your organization? Okay, so we'd like for you to take the time right now to think about, so we're gonna make it easy. You can pick one. Okay, because we only have like 3 minutes before our presentation's over, right? So pick one of these that you feel like, and to a lot of times for us, it's like, what's like the baby manageable step that's a realistic step, right? You know, so no like, you know, anarchy of the organization, right? You know. And then if people come up with the one thing, whether it's at the personal level or the institutional level, we'd like to hear from a couple of people that feel like they could make a commitment. And we'd like for you to write it down. Okay, so if you're not writing, there's a problem. Okay? Because we believe that if you write it,
It's more likely to happen.
it's more likely to happen.
And if you write it and then speak it, you might be able to speak it into existence.
Yes.
But the writing is an important component to it.
Yes.
I've been striving to do this work better and better all the time for the last 3+ years. And the one piece that I have not effectively done is to diversify my friendship base, my socialization base. I'm a white woman who has a lot of white friends. So when I go home, I hang out in my white neighborhood, and I go to things where only white folks are represented, and I want to stop that.
Let me high five you.
You got it.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. I just want to call attention to Christine, because Christine, can you say hi, Christine?
Hi, Christine.
Christine always says this piece in my classes. She's like, is it that people didn't have diversify their social networks, their friends, etc.? This is a really key, important piece. Thank you so much for sharing. Let's hear from somebody else. Yes.
I was going to also share on the personal level because I've recently started taking an ASL class, sign language, because that's often one that is not even talked about, because if you talk about the unemployment rate on that, it's pretty scary.
Right.
So that's something I'm doing for my personal, because I want to be able to communicate and make them included, but also like learn about a new culture, because we don't just learn the language, we also, they give us like the culture lesson of like the crazy things they go through every day. And it's nice because then it puts me into that mindset of like, okay, even though I think about the oppression of like being a woman and stuff like that, I forget about I have privilege in so many ways, let alone being able to live in a hearing world. It's mind-blowing, so.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing.
Do we have anyone who's wanting to take on the at the institutional level? Okay, let's go here and then.
Good.
I manage 50 apartments, and I've been there for over 14 years, and the population has changed over the years, which is so wonderful. But I get residents that come in and say that particular family, and they define them by their race and ethnicity, and I have to stop them and say, that is not how we talk about people in this office. If you have something to say, you will identify them by the apartment in which they live. If you're going to come into my office, that is a language that you need to use. And we have children, 80 to 100 children at any given time, and so, teaching them the same on a daily level, because they're going to take that with them to school. And our population is diversifying, which is so wonderful to see. Wonderful.
That's great.
So I would say with that, only discourage that. I mean, if they're talking about it and the identity has no basis for what's going on, and discourage it if they're using derogatory language, but don't put like don't put an obstacle before people, especially people of color, who are prideful about their ethnic or racial identity and who want to be known as, like my son, he's like, I'm black. And we worked hard in cultivating that because I think that's a point of pride for him. So if to not like be colorblind
Yeah.
or erase people's important parts or important aspects of their identity. So yes, if it has no merit or bearing into the conversation, do that.
That's great. We had a couple hands over here, so Christine and then someone else.
At the institutional level, to always be contributing to any exclusivity in like my school environment, where I'm working, like how am I excluding myself or isolating myself, or maybe noticing how others are isolated, and really working hard to reach out and see what I can do. Like if I have the connections to move up and say, you know, this person's feeling uncomfortable in this space because of this. So if I notice those things, I mean, to report those things or to share those things with those who can really like impact or affect change for that
Great.
situation.
Awesome. Did we have here and here? I don't know who was first. I think you were first and then Brenda.
Okay. So throughout this, my head's been going crazy. You know, what can I do? What steps can I start making? And all of a sudden, I felt like I had a light bulb moment about just start the conversation.
Yes.
You know, just ask and have the conversation with my workforce and start to really figure out what it is we're looking for and what fits, because I think every organization and every entity is different, and so what's going to really fit is not necessarily going to be the same at Lithia as it is going to be for me. And so, you know, I feel like that makes the most sense, is to just reach out and start somewhere, and that way it doesn't feel like I'm there to them as far as what I think is best. It's really more about that dialogue.
Yeah. And before we go to Brenda, it's amazing to see how afraid we are of, and I'm not saying like you in the room, but as a society, how afraid we are to have conversations. In fact, you might remember the Starbucks debacle of like a year ago or so. And admittedly, having baristas talk to you about race as you're getting your latte was probably not a good idea, right? However, what I am going to defend is I was able to go get the Starbucks insert newspaper that actually had some of these questions that had people thinking about things like, do your friend group look the same as you, right? Some really valuable questions. And do you know that like no one wanted to even open, or very few people wanted to even open up the insert. Like we're that afraid in our society to like even start a conversation. So kudos to the people who want to start a conversation. That really is where we have to go.
So I want to talk about, well, I'm from Grants Pass. So and I mean I'm a U.S. citizen, was born in California, but I identify myself as Mexican. I don't say you know what I mean. So and when people meet me, they first thing they say is, what part of Mexico are you born in? And in being in Grants Pass, working in the school district, my biggest issue is just advocating for the students, because they don't translate any paperwork. The kids don't get, the parents don't get any notification in Spanish. So, and they feel there's no need. I've had meetings with the superintendent, I've had meetings with the principals over and over this issue, and they seem like they're listening, and they show me that, I mean, from what I walk out thinking, oh, they care, but I've been doing this, you've known me so for years. And I've had her husband come to the school and talk, and it's just an issue that's been going on and on and on. And I was reading this, and it kind of, like, the school itself was number 3, because they act like, yes, we're gonna do it, but nothing ever gets done.
Thank you
So
for
it's
sharing it.
Yeah.
frustrating.
We'll talk. Yeah. We, I think, are at the end of our time, I believe, and I can't believe, yeah, we're over time, almost 5 minutes. We want to thank you so much for coming to our presentation. We are going to have our cards available. And we also, if your organization is interested in having some kind of training or continuing the conversation, you know, if you found that your organization was at a number 3, there are some really concrete steps that an organization can take to try to move to a different level, right? And so we could have those types of conversations.
Right, and if anybody's organization is at a 1 or 2, you all need help. And you don't have an option, because for that legal case, that means that you're engaging in some exclusionary processes that are illegal. So hopefully none of your institutions are there.
And you know, the last thing is, as Marjorie's getting her cards, I'm reminded of a conversation that I heard with some people that were from the Eagle Point district, and how we could be ready for the challenges of diversity. And I think that the Eagle Point people characterized it as, we were not really ready, we were not prepared, and then there was a lot of sort of clashes that happened, and then eventually they were like, okay, we're gonna get on board. We certainly don't want to be in that type of situation. We want to really be able to like ease into the diverse world that we're gonna have in the, you know, like best way possible for everybody, right? So anyway, thank you so much for coming to our presentation.